While Ukraine is impaling its elite divisions and very expensive NATO equipment on the Surovikin line, the Russian army is ramping up its offensive in Luhansk, and we know how the mainstream media likes to talk about Russian gains. However, some had the courage to talk about what's actually happening. Here, Politico. Ukraine braces as Kremlin steps up attacks on recaptured areas. France 24 reports. Ukraine recognizes difficult situation in the northeast. As you all remember, Ukraine recaptured Kupiansk on the 10th of September as they swooped through Russian lines during the Kharkiv offensive. Yeah, when I went MIA and missed the entire fireworks. Now just imagine if the Russians managed to recapture Kupiansk by the 10th of September.
I'll be back.
So yeah, the Russians are concentrating on Kupiansk from multiple directions. On the 7th of August, they launched a major attack along an 11-kilometer front, with follow-up attacks the next day that pushed the front line even further. This forced the Ukrainians 4 kilometers back. Like you see on screen, they did so aboard dozens of BMPs that rushed through Ukrainian positions after an artillery barrage. Now, if the Ukrainians abandon Kupiansk, they will lose control over very important railway lines, but it will also pave the way for the Russian army to push towards Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, along the H26 highway. Or, more plausible, they could pull an Ariel Sharon across the Suez Canal and race south towards Izium and take into a pincer dozens of Ukrainian brigades positioned on the east bank of the Oskol River. Yeah, so exciting, essentially bringing back the front to where it was in July 2022.
Oh shit, here we go again.
The Russians recently captured Novoselivske, which has been in a gray zone for about 2 weeks, and they're continuing their offensive from there. Here you can see how they gave the village the Bakhmut skincare treatment. A group of Ukrainians managed to retreat from the ruins of the village when they got ambushed by a combination of artillery and drones. This is when the Russians activated their piston type of attacks. 3 days later, on the 10th of August, some Russian assault detachments got a foothold in Kotlyarivka, which could encircle the Ukrainians in the village next door of Kislivka. We also talked about the Russian progress between Peshotravneve and Vilshana. Lastly, the Russians are also fighting on the outskirts of Sinkivka. After multiple attempts at storming the village of Sinkivka, Russian assault detachments managed to bypass the settlement on the right flank of the Ukrainians. During their push, the Russians captured 7 outposts and cut the road linking Sinkivka to Petropavlivka. We can rule out a Russian attack across these fields, since there's no cover over 2,500 meters, so they will most likely roll over the village from the east, and once the place is secured, make sure to clear out this entire forest to bring them as close as possible to Kupiansk. Essentially, the goal of the Russian army seems to be the P07 road, which, as you can see, leads directly to Kupiansk. The advantage of such major road is that the asphalt makes it much harder for the Ukrainians to remote mine the area and thus ambush Russian supply convoys. These remote mines will be clearly visible on the road. Now, the situation is so bad that General Syrsky, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, personally visited the front in Kupiansk. And I don't know about you, but even in these official pictures of his visit, Syrsky seems worried AF. And according to the Ukrainian Pravda, General Syrsky said, the Russians have created a fist for a breakthrough in the Kupiansk direction. They're creating an assault group consisting of 8 Storm Z assault detachments. He's referring to the accumulation of small Russian assault squads that creep their way forward using natural cover, like this forest, and then all of a sudden swarm Ukrainian positions from all sides, using local numerical superiority. It's a slow process, but they capture one outpost after another. Some Ukrainian soldiers deployed on the Luhansk front also spoke of the critical situation. The enemy has brought up fresh forces and a considerable number of assault units. It is carrying out attacks on foot through fields and forest strips, which is facilitated by 2-meter grass. On August 10th, reports mention how General Syrsky asked for urgent transfer of reserves towards Kupiansk. wait for it, in order to prevent the front from collapsing. However, what reserves can they send since the Ukrainian front is already stretched out? In preparation for intense battles, Ukrainian authorities evacuated 11,000 people from 37 settlements near the combat zone, but most of the residents came from the city of Kupiansk. According to these images, only women and children were allowed to evacuate, while all the males were mobilized into the army. Yeah, because these days the number of Ukrainian volunteers lined up at the recruitment office is as long as people waiting in front of GameStop for new games to be released. In both cases, people will have to be dragged in by force. The evacuation would allow the Ukrainian command to vacate buildings to accommodate troops. This confirms reports that Ukrainian reinforcements will be sent to this area, but also that they're preparing for a massive urban battle. However, notice how they also evacuated the west bank of the Oskol River. This could point towards the Ukrainians preparing for a Russian river crossing attempt near Masyutivka and Vorchina. If successful, this could flank enemy positions north of Kupiansk, and if this attack gains momentum, this could force the Ukrainians to abandon the town. What's very interesting to me is that the battle for the Oskol River looks almost exactly like a reverse battle of Kherson. But in this case, it's the Ukrainians that have their back against the river, which only have a couple bridges and pontoons to bring supplies over the river. Meanwhile, the Russians are positioned in a semicircle, pinning down as many Ukrainian troops as possible, while attempting to flank the Ukrainians both from the north and the south. And at the last moment, they could strike all these bridges and pontoon crossings and trap thousands of Ukrainian soldiers. Now, if you thought the situation in the north was critical, you're not ready for what's happening in the southern part of this front. To stop the Russians, Ukraine massed 7 brigades in this area between Torske and Kreminna. Yet, Russian detachments are creeping their way forward. In this video, we can see some Russian infantrymen, some sort of assault squads, clearing whatever is left of this Ukrainian stronghold. And here's a tragic video of 2 Ukrainians running away from this firefight. But today is not their lucky day, as they got spotted by an FPV drone. That's a phenomenon that's occurring more and more at the front. Kamikaze drones are now increasingly used directly against infantry, like in this video where we see a Ukrainian fire team in the middle of combat, when an FPV drone lurked over them and fell right into these 4 Ukrainian soldiers. That means that the Russians have so many of them that they can now attack infantry with it. Welcome to History Legends. Here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukrainian war. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my Ukraine videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. Thank you to everyone that has already helped. And welcome to the headquarters. Now let's backtrack a second. The problem of this footage I showed you earlier of the Russian assault squad is that it was geolocated right here on the map at the corner of these 2 tree lines. From these positions, the Russians are 600 meters away from this large forest. If they gather enough forces in this sector, they could sneak through these woods and attack Yampolivka, which they will most certainly capture, because this village will be very hard for Ukraine to resupply in ammunition and manpower. If the Russians get a hold of Yampolivka, they could push north in a wide maneuver to roll Ukrainian positions, which could be coupled with attacks at the center to pin down enemy troops. This could force the Ukrainians to withdraw behind the Zherebyets River and thus straighten the front line. Option 2 would be to focus their attention south towards Zarichne and Torske, and honestly that could be the plan, since on the 13th of August, the Russians ramped up their deliveries of Orthodox JDAMs on Ukrainian positions in Torske. Pro-Ukrainian Deep State UA also reported something troubling happening near Bilohorivka, that little town south of the Kreminna forest. Russian troops captured the filtering station on the 14th, located roughly 1 kilometer away from the city center. They claimed that lately, in that sector, they saw a lot of videos of Ukrainian military vehicles destroyed, but also a lot of friendly losses in the trenches, and they suggest that nothing good is happening there. The potential loss of the village could push Russian units up to Serebryanka. Overall, these 2 maneuvers, both from the north and the south, could trap thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and force them to abandon the entire forest, which in turn would threaten the city of Seversk. Even the loss of a small village, but whose position is strategic, could lead to a domino effect. Journalists of the French newspaper Le Monde actually visited Ukrainian troops near the forest of Kreminna, and even they claim that the situation is difficult. Their article is titled, "In a Forest of Northeastern Ukraine, the Deadly Thrust of Russian Forces." These journalists met with 57-year-old Ihor. He's the second in command of the 408th Battalion of the 21st Brigade. This brigade recently got equipped with Polish-made KTO Rosomak wheeled IFVs, Swedish Stridsvagn 122 tanks, and CV-90 armored combat vehicles. And according to this deployment map, the 21st Mechanized Brigade is indeed right there at the front. Ihor said, "I think it's accurate to say that we suffered 2 times more casualties on our side." What? Are you telling me that the guy with more firepower is inflicting more casualties? Trolling aside, remember he says this as the Ukrainians being the defenders inside fortified positions in the middle of a forest. And even then, the ratio of losses negatively impacts them. So imagine in open ground. As you can imagine, that's because of Russian artillery that continuously shells Ukrainian positions. Commander Ihor also admitted to the journalist that 2 weeks earlier, he went to visit his men on the contact line to boost their morale. His men were probably holding some little dugouts like this one. He talked to some guys, and as he left, a shell fell right where he was talking to them. Instantly, 3 of his men were KIA. A lot of the fighting takes place at close range. In this one, Ukrainian soldiers are pinned down by enemy shells. They call for support, but no response, until our POV main character gets wounded and brought back to the rear by his comrades. I hope he made it out alive. Sadly, such stories happen on a daily basis. In this next video, Ukrainians were ordered to dig new positions. However, what they didn't know, or rather what they haven't been told, is that they were sent right in front of Russian trenches.
Мы только начали обустраиваться, и я сижу, подходят 2 парня, мол, типа, они говорят, только, мы российские солдаты, а вы украинские. Будете сдаваться в плен? Говорю, конечно, конечно будем. Сдались в плен, вот мы тут оказались. На убой, раз я так понял, нас бросили, потому что, не просто так же, правильно? Если, смотрите, мы тут приехали, нас сразу... вот парни подошли, значит, они были очень рядом. И когда нас вели дальше, там буквально через 30 метров начиналась посадка, там очень много было русских. И я думаю, наше начальство, как так, вот как так можно посылать, просто выкопать окопы, если вот буквально в 50 метрах, что они не знали об этом.
And here's a video very similar to what this Ukrainian soldier was explaining, where we see 5 Ukrainians surrendering to Russian stormtroopers. And when resistance is too stiff, the Russians unleash their beasts. In this one, they even form an infernal column of sheer firepower, which they unchain at point blank on the enemy. The French journalists then continued their journey. They met with a 6-man fire team of the 32nd Mechanized Brigade somewhere at the rear. 3 of them said they went through NATO training in Germany for a month. One of them, called Serhiy, said, "The training is very interesting, but the combat techniques learned are not applicable for our situation in Ukraine, because of a lack of adequate weapons and ammunition." And then he goes on to say that the NATO tactics that they did learn are anyway poorly applied by their officers on the battlefield. The journalists also spoke with the battalion commander of the same 32nd Mechanized Brigade, and they could sense that he was overwhelmed by the speed of the Russian offensive. The 32nd Mechanized Brigade was sent as firefighters to stop the Russian river crossings over the Zherebyets River. Reports also mentioned that the Ukrainians knew about a Russian offensive near Svatove, but only expected Storm Z detachments to go into battle, and not entire battalions of mechanized and armored units. This is a clear failure of the Ukrainian intelligence services. And according to the latest news, the Russians are holding tight on these 2 hilltops. They managed to build several pontoons over the river, which they used to bring a lot of reinforcements to continue the offensive, which the Ukrainian artillery from the 32nd Brigade tried to intercept. In this case, they destroyed a Russian tank in the village of Nadia. And according to the latest news, the Russians managed to expand their bridgehead over the Zherebiets River once again. And now you understand why this battalion commander is under heavy pressure. His men are literally the last bearer, preventing the Ukrainian front from a massive debacle. But let's go back north to Kupiansk. Now obviously the Ukrainians are doing everything they can to prevent the Russians from reaching this objective. On Russian Telegram, reports mentioned the area to the east of Kupiansk is currently held only by mobile mechanized brigades, while no territorial defense brigades are observed. This is not entirely true and rather misleading. We do have the 32nd Mechanized, 43rd, 41st, 88th, 14th Mechanized Brigades positioned right in the center, but these are clearly supported by the 101st and 105th Territorial Defense Brigades on the left flank, as well as the 103rd on the right flank. And this Russian post also didn't take into account the presence of the 95th Air Assault Brigade, which is an elite formation that acts like some sort of firefighters. And there is even the 3rd Ukrainian Tank Brigade in reserve. On top of that, these Russian Telegram channels put a lot of emphasis on what they call mobile mechanized brigades as some sort of elite type of units compared to the very bad territorial defense troops. We already established in my previous videos that the 14th Mechanized Brigade, for example, is essentially a beefed up territorial defense brigade, beefed up by the fact that they have armored units now, but also because they have self-propelled howitzers, like this one you can see on screen, which fires cluster ammunition. It's more or less the same for other mobile units in the sector. Here you can see men of the 43rd Mechanized Brigade digging some trenches in a forest, and there's a high chance that a number of them are mobilized personnel. Or how about these images? Yes, they do have armored vehicles, but the troops seem to be between their 30s and 50s. And lastly, here's a video of the 41st Mechanized Brigade. Once again, just look at the guys that are there and you can come up to your own conclusions. Yet, we also had the reports from the French journalists saying that some of these troops of these mechanized brigades did in fact get NATO training. So essentially, all these brigades have a core of veterans, plus some NATO-trained troops, and lots of mobilized personnel. To me, all this means that Ukraine needs to gain time. So they stuffed the reserve units right into the line of fire to halt the Russian progression towards Kupiansk at all cost, with all losses being replenished by more mobilized personnel. Oh, that's not true. That's all Russian propaganda. Check this out. Here's what Taras Chmut said to Ukrainian newspaper Union.
А це сотні тисяч людей, які доведеться мобілізувати.
На додачу до тих, хто є.
На додачу до тих, хто є.
Taras Chmut added that Ukraine lost a very large number of motivated and trained people who had combat experience in the last 1.5 years, either irrecoverably or due to injuries. They need to be replaced in these trenches by someone. If I was to interpret his words, Ukraine lost most of the military personnel they had on day one of the war. Now, to be fair, mobilized personnel are not necessarily bad troops, because at this point, both Ukrainian and Russian armies are mostly made up of mobiks. Actually, here's the Russian perspective.
Алик, он находится уже тут на протяжении 10 месяцев.
Да.
Парень просто, он чуть стеснительный у нас, не медийный, мастер на все руки.
Кто вы по гражданской специальности?
Дорожник.
Вот такие у нас люди.
Никак не связано вообще с военной деятельностью.
Быстро адаптировались.
Быстро.
Семья гордится тем, что вы здесь.
Да.
The main reason the Ukrainian command is worried about the Kupiansk front is due to the failure of their air defense. You see, the Russian aviation is systematically targeting all company and battalion headquarters, as well as warehouses with fuel and ammunition. Russian aircraft can drop their FAB glide bombs from 50 kilometers away, far from the 25-kilometer range of the Aspide air defense systems, for example. As you can imagine, after several weeks of continuous airstrikes, almost all units of the Ukrainian army began to experience some sort of shortage of ammunition. In this one, the Russians had their eyes on an ammo dump located in Pischane, belonging to our beloved 14th Mechanized Brigade. You can see how they detected it because of a truck going to this house, which the Russians then struck. This could be another reason behind the evacuation of all the civilians. The Ukrainian army needs all the buildings they can for ammo storage purposes and to actually spread it out over a lot of small buildings instead of regrouping it and making it a bigger target. On the 11th of August, Russian aircraft dropped FAB-500 glide bombs into the Kupiansk administration building, which they thought housed the headquarters of the, drumroll, 14th Mechanized Brigade. The 14th is really taking all the hits in this one. And the next day, the Russians struck the Kupiansk-Ujlovoy railway station, which is an important logistical node of the Ukrainian army. The spokesman of the Ukrainian National Guard, Ruslan Muzychuk, spoke of the intensity of Russian firepower.
Приклад зменшення кількості взагалі обстрілів не йдеться. Якщо навіть аналізувати офіційні зведення чи ті інформації, яка надходить від підрозділів, які виконують задачі, то ми бачимо, що навіть за останній місяць кількість сумарна обстрілів по східному напрямку, це Куп'янський, Лиманський, Бахмутський, вона виросла досить багато. Якщо ми говорили у липні, наприклад, що це було протягом тижня десь 6-6,5 тисяч обстрілів, то протягом минулого тижня 9 тисяч обстрілів.
That last week that he talks about, when the Russians increased their consumption of artillery shells, coincides with the moment the Russians ramped up their offensive on Kupiansk. Muzychuk also said that Russian aviation carried more than 50 airstrikes on a daily basis and sometimes more than 80. We have to take a look at this article from the Kyiv Post. They interviewed Sergei Cherevati, the spokesman of the eastern group of the AFU. He said that over the last 24 hours, the Russians shelled Ukrainian positions with all type of artillery, from mortars to MLRS systems, 502 times. They continue to use aviation more actively in this direction and launched 15 airstrikes. The numbers might be a bit different, but the analysis is the same. If the Ukrainians can't find a way to halt Russian airstrikes with more air defense and shut down Russian howitzers with counter-battery fire, things will end up very bad in the sector. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The link is in the description below.